Last year I acquired a copy of Mark Fisher's K-Punk, initially through its recommendation on Stephen Shaviro's excellent blog, The Pinocchio Theory. Through a return to Mark's work, I realised just how much I'd previously enjoyed his writing, not least because we shared a common passion for punk, post-punk, and the music of the indie music of the 70s, 80s, and beyond. But also, and in the light of some of the conversations that carried on this morning, also because our intellectual trajectories were formed in the writings of the music journalism of that time, writing that led us to discover Marx, Nietzsche, the Situationist International, and post-structuralism via British cultural studies, though not necessarily in that order. This also led me to some of Marx's other writings, in particular Capitalist Realism, a book which I found of much interest when it was published, though I have to declare I have not drawn upon it in subsequent years. I was particularly struck by its poignancy and contemporary relevance, which I guess is why we're all here today. And most directly to chapter 1, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, and in particular, the origins of that term. And to chapter 6, all that is solid melts into PR. As these two chapters undoubtedly have great relevance to the work that I'm currently looking into as part of my own research and with architecture students at the University of Huddersfield. What also struck me were the differences that I had with Mark Fisher, not necessarily because I disagreed with him, but because of different disciplinary nuances and requirements. This is most evident in his rejection of the term postmodernism. Clearly, Fisher's work owes a great deal to Frederic Jameson's concept of the postmodern, and while I fully understand his scepticism for the term and the desire for an alternative terminology, even within capitalist realism itself, the cultural logic of Jameson's writing is very much in evidence. For those of us who developed our intellectual leanings in the same decade we formed our musical tastes, it seemed that at that time almost every other book contained the word postmodern. From Lyotard to Foster, from Croker's semiotext outpourings to David Harvey, the postmodern seemed everywhere. Something that is brilliantly exemplified by Dick Hebdage's exposition of at least 32 possible meanings of the term that he outlines in his collection, Hiding in the Light. I'll just give you a little moment to try and absorb some of those. As he says at the end of this quotation, indeed, we are in the presence of a buzzword. My own allegiance to the terminology is rooted in the use of its homonym, the postmodern, in architecture, especially in the work of Charles Jencks, whose 1977, The Language of Postmodern Architecture, still carries a great deal of leverage in architectural discourse. Jencks's description of the postmodern in architecture, capital P, capital M, is characterised as an eclectic form of architecture that principally uses historical quotation. While Jameson's description of postmodernism, first outlined in the New Left Review in 1984, is one word, all lowercase. And as the cultural logic of a third phase of capitalism has always seemed to me to reflect a more coherent sense of the monolithic nature of architectural culture and production, where everyone was, and still is, essentially doing the same thing. Jameson's statement, architecture is, however, of all the arts, closest constitutively to the economic, with which, in the form of commissions and land values, it has a virtually unmediated relationship, is for me one of the most important articulations of the complicit relationship between the corporate architectural complex and global finance. And it's quite clear that the majority of contemporary architecture stylistic differences are less significant than the ubiquity of organisational and infrastructural similarities, given that architects are able to employ any visual language that they choose. These four examples are from the same firm of architects, and despite the dissimilarities in the way they look, they are all essentially the same buildings. It could also be argued that the most important technologies in architectural production have not been the shape-making CAD software or the advances in new materials, new communication systems and new energy systems, but the technologies of finance and procurement that have reduced all architecture to a status of commodity. Another important element of Jameson's postmodernism, which I think touches very much on Fisher's work, is his articulation of postmodern hyperspace, as exemplified by the analysis of John Portman's Bonaventura Hotel in Los Angeles, a building that Jenks would stylistically characterise as late modern. But again, as Jameson argues, the stylistic aspects of its mirrored surface, exterior surface, is less significant compared with the dizzying spaces of its interior. Jameson's description of the Bonaventura's lobby space addresses more contemporary concerns regarding how our subjectivity and agency needs to adapt to these new spatial types. There has been a mutation in the object, the postmodern building, unaccompanied as yet by an equivalent mutation in the subject. We do not possess the perceptual equipment to match this new hyperspace, as I will call it, in part because our perceptual habits were formed in that older kind of space I have called the space of high modernism. The newer architecture therefore stands as something like an imperative to grow new organs, to expand our sensorium and our body to some new, as yet unimaginable, ultimately impossible dimension. This was before the invention of GPS, by the way. It is in this linking of technology, capital and cultural production that is still one of the most powerful aspects of Jameson's conception of the postmodernism as the cultural logic of late capitalism. And while his periodization, as many critics have pointed out, is highly generalized and indeed problematic, its overall utility is still highly persuasive. But perhaps I would want to make one change by using Fisher's capitalist realism to describe the representations of this cultural epoch, and use postmodernism itself to describe the overall nexus of these relationships. And here I'm arguing that capitalist realism signifies the return to the pre-modernist hegemonies of realism, where the authority of the academy is replaced by the authority of the market. And clearly, as we enter a period that will be that could be characterised as a fourth industrial revolution or industry 4.0, perhaps constituted by the nano-bio info technologies that will undoubtedly bring about new forms of economic relationships, that will itself implement new cultural formations, and what they will be is still to be decided. The title of the first chapter of Capitalist Realism, a phrase that Fisher attributes to both Slavoj Zizeck and Jameson, actually first appeared in an essay by Jameson in the New Left Review, which contained a review of two books published by the Dutch architect Rem Koolhaas under the title Future City. Jameson had previously written on Koolhaas in another review for the Village Voice on his previous tome, published on the works of his company, OMA, the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, the essay titled Space and Congestion, Rem Koolhaas and SMLXL, an overview of their work up to that date. In both essays, which can be found in the anthology of Jameson's writings, The Ideologies of Theory, in both essays, Jameson is clearly both fascinated and troubled by Koolhaas's work and ideas, a feature that I tend to share, though for different reasons. The two books that form the subject of Future City, The Great Leap Forward and the Harvard Design School Guide to Shopping, were produced by Koolhaas while a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, bringing together research from colleagues and research students that map shifts in global architecture, particularly with the rise of Asia as the dominant centre for emerging architectural activity. What should also be kind of made clear is that these two books were published by Taschen, which is quite an unusual choice for this kind of academic publishing. And it again speaks to Koolhaas's desire to sort of step outside of traditional academic routes and venues. Much of Jameson's essay focuses on Koolhaas's own contribution to the Guide to Shopping, an essay entitled Junkspace. As Jameson points out, Junkspace is an extraordinary piece of writing, part polemical rant, seemingly part stream of consciousness, and overall an excoriating indictment of the mediocrity of contemporary architecture, despite some of its apparent excesses. Disregarding nearly all academic conventions, it's written as one long paragraph, no section headings, no references or footnotes, just the relentless attack on the ubiquity of contemporary commercial architecture. It bears more similarities to a type of frenzied science fiction short story written by someone like Philip K. Dick, or could be compared to an updated version of one of William S. Burroughs' routines from The Naked Lunch. Rabbit is the new beef. Has ever a more unlikely set of words started an architectural essay? It is a deliberate and provocative challenge to his formalist contemporaries in that it sets out an argument against a system where ideas and values have been turned upside down, given that rabbit was once considered the food of the poor and is now a delicacy, while beef, once a luxury, becomes an everyday option. The essay goes on to attack the mediocrity in planning, poor use of materials, poor ideas, the infantilization of the public, and the banalisation of public space. But most of all, it addresses the alienation of users, workers, and even the designers of junk space, in many ways that chime closely with the themes of Fisher's writing. But it is important to remember that this is written by the CEO of one of the biggest architectural practices in the world, a man who had only 2 years earlier had won the Pritzker Prize, considered by some as the Nobel Prize of Architecture, and who 2 years later would be given the Royal Institute of British Architects Gold Medal. So I suppose that would be considered the BAFTA of architecture. In this respect, it is interesting to compare Rem Koolhaas with Fisher's description of the fate that befell Gerard Ratner after describing his company's jewellery as total crap. Whereas Ratner was cast out of his role, Rem went on to be considered even more of a postmodern genius. Rem had previously produced his own concepts for totalising monolithic structures that extended across the urban realm, except he saw them as a positive typology for architectural space, such as his student graduation project Exodus, a homage to the Italian Marxist architectural collective Superstudio, who imagined a more critical realisation in their continuous urban monument, itself a precursor to Jameson's conception of totalising urban space. Also in his delirious New York, Koolhaas presents the Manhattan grid as a form of infrastructure that allows the deployment often of a number of other different possibilities. However, they all become flattened and rendered equivalent. Perhaps OMA's most significant work was the competition entry for the Parc La Villette, which has perhaps gone on to become the most important template for the planning of towns and cities across the world, many of which have been produced by OMA and their acolytes. There is no doubt that OMA can be considered one of the most formally innovative architectural practices, who produce iconic and provocative building designs. But it is significant that in Junkspace, Koolhaas does not seek to exclude OMA's output from the focus of his ire, but seemingly understands that he is complicit in the production of Junkspace as much as everyone else. In this respect, Koolhaas is ambivalent, is reminiscent of his fellow Dutchman, the film director Paul Verhoeven, who in the 80s and 90s made a series of Hollywood blockbusters that parried the banality of the Hollywood blockbuster itself, albeit where they were both critical and commercial successes. And despite this apparent cynicism, Verhoeven was still able to say interesting things about identity, agency, and even the seductive appeal of fascism. Chapter 6 of Capitalist Realism is a witty detourment of the phrase, "all that is solid melts into air," initially found in the Communist Manifesto and used by Marshall Berman in his 1982 book of the same name. Fisher quotes Berman on the absurdity of the public relations exercise undertaken by Stalin following the construction of the White Sea Canal as an example of bureaucracy impeding the delivery of a project, only to engage with using the structures of PR for the ideological purposes of showing what a great idea it was. And it is a lesson that is still salutary to the types of projects and PR that are being undertaken across the world today. This leads me to briefly want to outline some current themes that are bound up with some of the work that I'm currently pursuing with architecture students at the University of Huddersfield, particularly in relation to the redevelopment of Huddersfield, or the proposed redevelopment of Huddersfield by Kirklees Council, and most centrally to whether their vision constitutes a genuine attempt to construct a progressive form of urbanism that addresses the shifting patterns of labour, technology and demographics, or whether it is simply recycling more of the same. At first reading, it does suggest some interesting ideas, but on closer inspection, they appear to be focused on a woefully outdated model of retail that will simply perpetuate junk space and is using PR to tell us how different that is. In the projects that are being developed with the students, We are trying to find alternatives and looking for an inspiration in new approaches to technology and models of open source and collaborative ways of working that contest the divisive ideologies of neoliberalism. Borrowing ideas from Srnicek and Williams and their approach to a progressive reimagining of the modernist project, utilising full automation, and Paul Mason's call for the adoption of open source approaches to social organisation and finance. It is only through asking what-if questions and continuing to speculate on possible futures we will be able to enact them. David Harvey's 2002 book, Spaces of Hope, at the end there is an interesting appendix in the form of a short story reminiscent of Edward Bellamy's novel, Looking Backwards, 2000 to 1887. In his short story, Harvey imagines the collapse of capitalism, which is followed at first by chaos, but then by the emergence of a new environment of trust and cooperation. But like the hero in Bellamy's novel, Harvey wakes up to find it was all a dream. But, as Captain Sensible reminded us 20 years earlier, channeling Rogers and Hammerstein, you've got to have a dream, because if you don't have a dream, how are you going to make a dream come true?